Hi, I'm Andy Wright, partner in the technology practice here at Odgers. In this series, Secrets to Scaling, I sit down with the top leaders from the technology sector to hear what they've learned on the path to scaling companies. And today, I am delighted to be joined by Jamie Heywood, who has helped scale some of the world's most recognizable companies, from Virgin and Amazon through to Uber, where he grew the business to over 5 billion in revenues in 13 countries across Europe. Jamie, thank you for being here today.
Great to be here, Andy.
So your career started in Asia. Tell us about some of those early experiences and how they shaped you today.
Yeah. So I was born in Hong Kong to an American mother and a British father, and then spent the first 13 years of my life in Asia. So when I graduated from college, UK was in a recession, and I thought, I need to get back. So I joined a trading company based in Hong Kong, and my first job was selling used Volvos in Taiwan, which I did for 2.5 years, and then I went into a state-owned state-owned bottler in a place called Hangzhou, which we were buying to turn into a Coca-Cola bottler. And the company we bought was a cooperative. It was a sort of old communist-style cooperative selling green tea to the Chinese population. And like an old cooperative, it owned the apartments, it owned the sort of doctor surgery, it owned the schools, and we had to turn that into a commercial entity bottling Coca-Cola and Fanta and Sprite. So I did that for 4 years, and then did an MBA at INSEAD, and then came back out to Asia and spent sort of 15 years in telecom. So I helped set up Virgin Mobile's business in China and in India, and I launched Orange's business in Thailand. So, looking back on that period, which was in total about 20 years, 5 years of the kind of Coca-Cola bottling and used cars, to 15 years in telecoms, it was a period of just incredible growth. It was growing because Asia was growing, but it was also growing because mobile telecoms was having just a fantastic period from 1998 when I joined to sort of 2014 when I finally left. And growth is what I found myself addicted to. It means that a company's getting things right. It means you're making a difference to consumers because more and more of them are willing to pay. And from a career perspective, it was fantastic, right? Because a growing company creates opportunities. Growth eliminates politics. It gives everyone a lot to do. So, after those early times in Asia, I've really sort of gone looking for the next wave of growth again and again and again.
Yeah. Your time in telecoms, I think, covered everything from a startup at Orange in Thailand to a turnaround to Virgin Mobile in the
Yeah.
UK, from, as you described, failure to success in some instances, and from China to the UK. So just be interested to hear what you think maybe the constant is across all of those very diverse experiences.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, my period in mobile telecoms it was a very sort of lucky period, I think, within the industry. And every technology wave and every industry goes through a period of heady growth, and then it sort of stabilizes, and then probably it declines, and everyone goes looking for efficiencies. And though that period in the sort of late 90s to the first decade of this century was a really strong growth sort of 15 years for mobile telecom. So I started, I joined Orange in the UK and then got posted out to Thailand in 2001. And, Thailand it was a greenfield startup, as was Virgin Mobile in India when I joined to set that up. So that was 6 of us getting off an aeroplane. It was a joint venture with a big chicken and prawn producer in Thailand, going, we need to launch a GSM network. And the challenges of startup businesses are scaling challenges, but they have a different flavor and a different sort of smell to them, to scaling challenges when you're scaling a bigger business. It's about recruiting and energizing a fantastic team of people. It's about finding product market fit, because if frankly you haven't got revenues, you haven't got anything. And so that hunt for, an innovative way of trying to put a new product out into market. So in Thailand, we sort of we put out just a very radical sort of pricing method with handsets that sort of completely disrupted competition there. In India, we launched with a proposition where we paid consumers to receive calls as a way of encouraging them to change. And all of those are innovations trying to sort of figure out how do you crack the market. And then you just try and keep up, right? And it's about keeping control if you can ignite the growth. And in both of those markets, we grew to more than 1 million customers. In Thailand, we did it in 10 months. In India, we did it in 18 months. But that's phenomenal scaling. That's sort of 100% plus year on year or quarter on quarter in the early days. So there it's just like hold on tight and try and keep up, which is the sort of startup growth challenge. If I look at the later end of my career, I by then we had 2 boys, and I was not able to just sort of run around Asia with my wife. So we came back to the UK, and I started running Virgin Mobile's business here in the UK. And when I came into that was already a scaled business, right? That was a business with 500 million of revenue, and it was well established. It was also part of Virgin Media, so it was not an independent company. It was part of a quad play with broadband TV and fixed line. So it was just much more complicated. And there our aspirations for growth were 10% year on year, not 100% quarter on quarter. But the bigger a business is, the more complicated and more complex it gets. And it gets complex just by virtue of its size, but it also gets complex because you're grappling with, future growth against, an existing customer base, and how much do you cannibalize yourself? And you're grappling with, how do I prioritize growth over profitability? How do I prioritize innovation over efficiency? And the bigger a company gets, those complexities start to sort of just make it harder and harder and harder. And so there, the challenges we faced were, I would say, much less that kind of heady, adrenaline-induced challenge of growth. And it was much more about sort of processes and principles and things that would be probably much more recognizable to people in big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, having ridden the telecom wave in those early startup modes, but also then in the bigger companies that emerged the other side, I've sort of tried to think back and think, what is it about a startup company that gives it its flavor, and what is it about scaling a bigger company that gives it its flavor? And actually, some of the most interesting insights I've got actually go into the social sciences and into anthropology. And there's these studies done by this Oxford professor called Robin Dunbar, who he studied the way communities grow globally, and he identified this number at about 150 to 200 people, where for communities that are smaller than that, everyone knows everyone else, right? And it's all about personal relationships and personal trust, and and a knowledge about how people work. And then after 150, he said our brains are just not big enough to keep that degree of personal information in place. And we need to then resort to other mechanisms and other means to try and encourage cooperation and alignment.
Mm-hmm.
And in communities, he argues that's things like religions and hierarchies and social norms and things like this. And I think there's many similarities in the way that communities have grown to the way that companies grown, and the things you rely on to scale an early business. It's very personal. It's very, very personal. You know everyone. You've probably recruited everyone, and you don't need to put lots of processes in place. But there comes a stage at around that 150, 200 person mark where if you try and rely on personal relationships, the whole place will break, right? It just won't sustain. And you need to then think about other ways of maintaining alignment and coordination and cooperation ideally that don't fall into bureaucracy, but that are not just predicated on personal relationships. And mobile telecoms, I've seen both sides of that equation.
So that addiction to growth that you talk about brought you from one legendary group to another, from Virgin to Amazon. And when we talk about growth and talk about scale, you look at Amazon and they have an iconic approach to scaling, and they do it at the biggest scale you can imagine. So I'd just be fascinated to know what that looks like in practice from the inside in terms of Amazon's leadership principles and how they play out to enable such a growth mindset at a company that I think is now 1.5 million people.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I very much sort of rode the mobile wave until the growth was fully sort of
Bitter end.
fully extracted. And, so when I realized the growth was sort of no longer going to happen in mobile in the UK, I went looking for the next growth kick and joined Amazon. And I think no business has thought as deeply about how to scale as Amazon has. And, when I left the company, so I joined in 2014 and left in 2018. And in 2018, the company had grown 20% year on year for 20 consecutive years, 20% or more year on year for 20 consecutive years, which means doubling every 3.5, 4 years. And that's doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling. And, how you do that without becoming bureaucratic is an incredibly difficult challenge. And the way Amazon thought about it, and they lived it very viscerally, is Jeff Bezos had this mantra, which is it's always day one, right? And it's always day one means we always need to think like a startup. We always need to think like we're disrupting. And someone in one of the Amazon sort of all hands said, "So Jeff," the cheeky guy at the back, "So Jeff, what does day two look like?" And he said, day two is stasis, bureaucracy, and death. And that's why it's day one. And so I think Amazon is born of this sort of paranoia with bureaucracy. And I think therefore, it's tried to think, how do we grow 20% year on year for 20 years? How do we keep doubling ourselves without becoming bureaucratic? And the answer Amazon came up with, is the leadership principles. The leadership principles are, when I was there, there were 12 principles, and they were things like earns trust or dive deep, right? Which meant always go into the data if you have a resolution, have backbone. So, be willing to stand up for things you really believe in, be customer obsessed. And these principles, each of which had a sort of 3-line descriptor underneath that everyone had to learn, were meant to be the guidelines about how everyone should behave. And the logic was, if everyone drank this Kool-Aid, and it is a form of Kool-Aid, it's a form of sort of cultish indoctrination. If everyone put on the glasses of the leadership principles, then the alignment and coordination that you could get from bureaucratic and managerial oversight, it will just arise spontaneously. So that was the logic. And frankly, having seen it, I do think it works. But what it required them to do was to live it everywhere, which is why it has a sort of cult-like feel to it. And so if I give you some examples about what it felt like on the inside. So, when you go, I was recruited, and you go into the Amazon recruitment process feels very cold. You go into a room, and I think I was interviewed by 6 people. Each interview was about 20 minutes long. And they asked me one question. And it was a question that I now realize was related to a leadership principle. So if the leadership principle they'd been asked to test was earns trust, say, then there was this bank of questions that would be something like, could you describe a situation where, you lost the trust of a teammate? What did you do and how did you behave? And then, at the end, all of these, and there was no small talk. There was no nice to meet you, tell me about where you're from. It was just a ruthless sort of question against a leadership principle bank. And then at the end, those people came together and compared notes and worked out whether you met the Amazonian bar, which is the language they had on these principles. So, so very, very sort of considered and ruthless. When it came to promotions, the whole promotion process, everyone's behavior is not assessed against performance directly. It's assessed against behaviors against the leadership principles. When it comes to sort of the way you're meant to take decisions, you don't have to go to your manager if the leadership principles gives you an indication as to how you're to behave. So, I honestly don't think you can lift the leadership principles into any other company, because it's a cultural kind of and process sort of mix that they've evolved over 20 years. But it's exceptionally powerful, because if everyone is sort of living and breathing the same thing, people align without managers having to come in and coordinate. And that, I think, is one of the secrets to sort of then allowing you to double your size every 3.5 years without, quadrupling your management team and, quintupling the number of management layers you have above people, which will just sort of stymie them and stifle them. And so I think Amazon is, just an exceptionally interesting company as to how they have successfully scaled.
But to your point, it's very difficult for another company to adopt those leadership principles. If another company had an interview process like that, I think the person on the other side of the interview process would probably be turned off. But because it's Amazon, they have that brand, so it's difficult for that to be lifted into another
I think
business.
it's not. I think that's certainly one thing.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, it's all of these things interplay with each other. So if you just change the recruitment process, but you didn't change the career development process, I think, or you didn't change the way that presentations were required to be written on 6 pages with lots of data. If you just picked 70% of the pieces, the whole thing would fall apart. It's like a sort of, it's like an organic system which can't survive without all of the components in place. And, Jeff Bezos, when he was writing the leadership principles, in conjunction with, his leadership team, sort of said, look, when we make the company culture explicit, we are just writing down what is already there but not said. We are not inventing it, right? And so this idea of the culture being emergent, and it's very hard to sort of come down and just like impose a culture, and that means that companies that sort of look at Amazon and say, well, and lots of individuals have left Amazon and tried to sort of take the components, almost all unsuccessfully, right? Because if you go and argue for some of these, if you haven't completely drunk the Kool-Aid, things look very, very peculiar, right? And Amazon almost prides itself on its peculiarity. And companies, if someone comes from Amazon and says, no, there's going to be no more presentations, we're only going to deal with 6-page docs, right? Which everyone has to sit down and read before the meeting starts. Everyone's going to go, oh, that's not how we do it here. And so I think Amazon, I think the cleverness is in all the components kind of reinforcing each other, rather than any one piece.
How much of it is about bottom up versus top down management? Because I think that's a key component you see to successful businesses today, and I think that is a key aspect of Amazon's leadership.
I think Amazon, I mean, everything I say I can caveat with, I left Amazon probably 6 years ago, but I think Amazon, from my experience, goes through waves, right? And there are periods, including the period when I was there, where it was really prioritizing innovation and launching new stuff. So it launched the Fire Phone, it launched unsuccessfully, it launched Prime, Video, it launched Alexa, it launched grocery. and there was this big push to sort of to launch businesses. And I think in that mode, Amazon was incredibly good at pushing autonomy in. Its model for kind of innovating businesses was set these businesses up almost away from the core, give them a lot of autonomy, give them a lot of resources. If they thrive, integrate them back in, and if they die, kill them quickly. So that in that mode, I think Amazon is very good at breeding autonomy and pushing it out. I think though it also goes through phases, and I'd say it's probably been like that for the last few years, where it identifies the bigger opportunity in efficiencies, because it's a huge business, and so extracting efficiencies and scaling benefits requires a different sort of managerial ethos. You're prioritizing standardization, and you're not prioritizing autonomy. Autonomy has everyone doing different things. Standardization has everyone following a playbook. And I think Amazon goes through those cycles, and is quite good at flexing its kind of managerial style, depending on what it thinks is the greater opportunity. Is it that it's it needs to be growing, or is it that actually it really wants to be pushing efficiencies and be prioritizing profitability?
Yeah. So I think your career's kind of got lots of calculated risks when you've made a move, and in 2018 you took the calculated risk of going from Amazon, which was I think the second biggest business globally by market cap, to Uber. And if we can wind the clock back and set the scene a bit, in 2017, Uber had this, what you call, a near fatal episode. The founder had stepped down amid controversy. The business was loss making, and here in London had lost its license to operate from TfL. So I think it's fair to say you joined a business in existential crisis. Can you tell us a bit about the kind of company you joined in 2018?
Yeah, so I like everyone else in probably late 2017, early 2018, I was just opening the paper, sort of metaphorically, or scrolling down the paper, literally, and seeing just crisis after crisis hitting Uber. And reading about it sort of as oh my God, this is just a catastrophe. So the crises that hit were, Travis Kalanick was exited, having kind of, having on TV berated a driver for not being good enough. There was stories about misogyny and sort of sexual harassment in the workplace. Uber was being taken to court by Google for having hired a Waymo sort of executive out of Google's AI autonomous driving division into Google to set up their autonomous division. And that was just the US side of thing. In the UK side of things, TfL took away Uber's license for not being fit and proper. There were examples and citing examples where Uber had used its technology to evade law enforcement. And there were court cases around workers' rights, sort of gradually working its way up to the Supreme Court. So that was the environment when I got the call from the headhunter, not you guys, saying, look, Jamie, would you be interested in taking over Uber's Northern European business? And Travis had been exited, and the person who'd run the UK business had also left. So it felt very, very precarious. And I remember talking to my wife about the decision, and she said, Jamie, what on earth are you doing? This is a morally toxic company. And so, they made me the offer, and I was very unsure. And so I ended up then going to San Francisco and meeting Dara and sort of saying, look, what do you think happened? And he told the story about a company that had just grown phenomenally quickly. It had grown to 40 billion of market capitalization in 4 years, and it had just grown so fast it had lost control. And he said, look, he was committed to sort of making the changes needed to bring the company back into control and make sure it was a good partner for cities. And I believed him and joined. So the company I came into, that one that was one that was very sort of shell shocked, right? And it was one that um, had both been phenomenally successful. If you were a member of the UK or the Dutch or the Scandinavian team at the time, you felt you'd redefined the taxi industry. So on the one side, we had a team that really had done remarkable things. On the other side, we had a complete burning platform where no one could say that change was not required. And so when I came in and I started looking at the behaviors, you could see that the behaviors of the company were very much the behaviors of an aggressive, pugnacious startup that felt that it was only going to survive if it took on the world. And that was Travis's character, right? He was out there to change the world, and therefore it bred a certain militarism. It was real tech bro stuff. It was very good at executing. It was not very good at thinking.
I think the strapline was always be hustling under Travis.
Yes, I mean that was one of the always be hustling was one of the values, as was toe stepping, right? I mean, to give you, and principled confrontation. So the values of the company, and the values were born out of Travis's belief that the taxi industry was a kind of monopoly industry run by a bunch of fleet providers, and not exposed to competition because regulators were kind of in their pocket, right? So he had a very, very adversarial view of what he had to do, which was to wage war on the status quo. And that kind of Che Guevara mentality, it can make sense if you're in the early stages of a company. It doesn't make sense when you're worth 40 billion and you're operating in 200 cities globally, and there are millions of customers who depend on you for their safety and their provision, and cities are looking at you and thinking, I don't need lots of ride-hailing drivers congesting my street. I don't want the pollution that this brings in. And so the kind of the evangelical rebel mentality that was Uber 1.0 just got locked in and needed to transition to a much more, I would say, mature, still growth focused, but mature, aware mentality that was Uber 2.0. And a lot of that required getting rid of those always be hustling, toe stepping, principled confrontation principles, or that Travis had sort of enshrined in the company before he left.
Yeah. I think the strapline became do the right thing. So it's quite a dramatic shift. I'd just be intrigued to know, where do you start when you come into a business and you've got to reinvent the culture that drastically?
Yeah, I mean, the do the right thing period was, it was very important. I think and I mean, that change was very much led by Dara, right? Who deserves a lot of the credit for kind of really leading the company out of its existential crisis. And, I think what Dara was looking for was to try and find real symbolic acts, right? And when I say that, I don't mean symbolic as in they are only symbols, but they resonate very broadly across many domains. And I think the do the right thing period and changing the company principles and making that one of them was a really big signal to the organization that, we're a moral organization with responsibilities to our stakeholders, not just a responsibility to our shareholders to grow. And I think that was a very, very big kind of stamp, because, it's a strong statement. What that looked like to me, when I came into the UK business, the way I sort of took on that mantle that Dara had initiated was, I sort of tried to tell the story. The advantage I had in London was actually, which is where Uber was based in the UK, was the platform was burning hotter here than anywhere else globally, right? I mean, because we had no license, and and London was one of Uber's biggest cities, one of its most profitable cities. And, you know, if we couldn't get our license back, we were allowed to operate because we were appealing it. But if we didn't get our license back, the thought was there could be a domino effect, right? And it's like, well, if London doesn't leave, Uber has a right to operate, nowhere does. And we very quickly sort of came to the conclusion that, to earn our right to operate in London, we needed to be seen not as the creator of a lot of problems, right? Safety problems and congestion problems and workers' rights problems and pollution problems, but actually as part of the mayor's solution for all of these problems. And, so in the first few months when I was at Uber, we sort of said, well, okay, so what does that mean in practice, right? And we, Sadiq Khan in London, but it would be very similar in all the cities that I was looking after, had a mantra, which is we need fewer private cars, right? So he'd set a goal in London to have 20% fewer private cars by 2030, and all the cars should be electric. And we said, okay, look, we can get behind that. That's something we know how to do. But to do that, we needed to not just rethink about the ride-hailing fleet and the electrification of the ride-hailing fleet. We also needed to think, what are all the other modes we need to enable? So we integrated public transport into the Uber app. We launched Uber Boats, right, to make use of the city. We launched Lime bikes. We made the EV commitment to be fully electric in London by 2025. And so all of these were part of a bigger play, which was to say, look, actually, our purpose is not to just grow, right? Because if we grow and our stakeholders believe our growth creates problems for them, we're just gonna die under the sort of the weight of kickback from them. We need to work out how we grow in a way that works for the stakeholders. So we came in and we sort of rethought the strategy around in a way that was very consistent with what London wanted, which is fewer private cars. And most private cars sit empty 95% of the time. So actually, if people don't need to own a private car, and they get a Lime bike or an Uber boat, great. Everyone wins. Internally, though, that also required that we were a very, very different type of organization. So the kind of militaristic, we need 400 drivers out Leicester Square Saturday night, let's go implement it, sort of Uber 1.0 organization needed to become much better at listening, much better at sort of deep problem solving, stakeholder management, almost diplomacy in some situations. And, the way I brought that to the team was I said, look, this is what we need to change as a business, and this is what it means for us as individuals. And I talked about Uber 1.0 and Uber 2.0. And I talked about how the teams would behave in the two different worlds, the past and the future. And I talked about it as a process of bereavement, right? Because many people who've given their lives to Uber 1.0, they define their success in terms of 1.0 values. And they had to let go of those things. So in bereavement, it's sort of denial, anger, acceptance, growth. And I said, look, we're going to go through that same journey together. And I said, at some stages in that journey, many of you will leave. And that's okay, right? That's your decision that you don't want to come on the second stage of this Uber journey. And in some situations, I let people go. I said, look, I don't think you will be able to make the journey. And I think that's important for a leader to sort of symbolically show how important it is to get behind the cultural values that the business needs to create. Because a leader is, I think, more judged on what they do than what they say. So most people, we lost about a third of the organization over the next 2 years. Most of those people opted out themselves, and we brought in some great new people who were much more consistent with the vision, and some people we let go. But it was important, I think, to explain it as a journey and to explain it as a Uber moving from a clumsy, sort of often ugly, spotty, ill-coordinated adolescent into a sort of a young adult. And, it's not therefore that we had to reject everything, but there were very important aspects that we did need to reject, and be very explicit in putting them behind us. And that process was 4 years. It was not something we turned around quickly. I think it took 18 months before I was confident that it would bed in, because in the end, it beds in only when you can feel the momentum coming out of the organization for change, not when it's being preached from the top. And I remember the sort of the moment when I sort of knew it had bitten. We were at an offsite about 18 months after I joined, and we'd been running these bottom-up sort of team focus groups where we'd said to employees, look, if you want to change something in the organization, we'll give you the space and the budgets and the remit to do it. So people took on career development and they took on decision making. And then we asked these groups to present at the team offsite. And one guy in one of these groups was getting quite frustrated by some of the cynical questions coming at him. And he was an advocate for change. And he said, okay, I've had enough of this. And he was not senior in the organization at all. He said, I've had enough of this. Like, I'm for change. If you're not for change, keep quiet and leave the room. And he can say that because he'd been in the company a while. He was relatively junior, and it really stuck. And when you can feel, therefore, that the push for change is not coming from the top, but it's coming from people who are in the middle of the organization, knowing that they need to sort of like break out of the chrysalis and emerge as a new entity, then you're winning, right? And it goes back to, I think companies being primarily, communities. That's a dynamic you'd recognize in any sort of community change, right? It's when you feel the bottom up swell, not just when you hear a few people at the top sort of chanting things.
But the shift sort of reflects the broader shift we've seen in the market from growth at all costs to growth with profitability, sustainability, and purpose at its core. And I think some people sometimes see them as interchangeable. There's growth or profitability, it's growth or sustainability or purpose. And you managed to electrify the fleet, reinstill the TfL license, as you say, have a more sustainable travel mix, all of these amazing achievements, but also grow the business by 50% in the same time. So it does show that you can have both.
You can. I think it's important to say you can have both over the long term. I think in the short term, those trade-offs are very real. So, the electrification of the fleet required us to sort of invest £120 million in helping drivers upgrade to EVs, right? The implementation of holiday pay, workers' rights, pensions cost £600 million for the business. So in the short term, that's monies that could have been put to other uses either inside the UK or outside, or could have gone to shareholders. But in the long term, if we look at the health of the business, I think those investments will easily be paid back by the fact that we're now, a trusted partner to grow with cities across the region. We're doing AI pilots endorsed by TfL in London at the moment. That level of cooperation would not have been possible, or sort of autonomous vehicles would not have been possible unless we'd earned the trust of the stakeholders that we had. So I think in the short term there are trade-offs between those things, and we put purpose ahead of profit for that period, and I think actually probably in the long term the best route to growth and the best route to profitability is not to focus directly on either of those, but really to focus on purpose. And if you do the right thing and you look after customers and you make sure your stakeholders are supporters of your growth, the growth will come and the profits will come. But if you try and reverse the means and ends and say, profits is what I'm going to focus on, and therefore I need to grow, and therefore I need to sort of keep my stakeholders happy, I think that's not a that's not a that's not a reliable recipe.
Mhm. But whilst you were there as well, the company went public, IPO'd in
Mhm.
2019, and I think when you left, the company was on the verge of being profitable. So it must look and feel like a very different company when you become public and then
It does, and yeah,
profitability.
and the share price is up sort
Yeah,
of 300% in the last 4 years. So it does. It has. I think that the changes we made back in 2018, well, 2018 to 2022, are the fruits are still being felt.
yeah, yeah. And I think you took a real interest in the energy transition at Uber, electrifying the fleet, and continued that as CEO of Zolar.
Hmm.
Today, you're now expanding the board portfolio and focusing on supporting companies as a non-executive, one of which is Guy's and St Thomas,
Yep.
which is the UK's largest NHS trust.
Hmm.
So tell us a bit about that journey from exec to non-exec and from Uber to the NHS, and I suppose the common challenges that you see in these very different areas.
Yeah. Um, I mean, all career journeys start with a kind of personal story, right? And the personal story I have now is I'm 55 and my two boys have just left to go to university. So I can feel myself entering a kind of a life transition, and as part of that, I'm looking to sort of not necessarily just take one role and go deep, or one problem and go deep. I'm actually much more interested in probably trying to deal with multiple spaces, and try and be a bit shallow across them. And there's sort of three areas I'm really focused on now as part of my kind of transition to portfolio. The first one is, as you say, the energy transition. I after having left Uber, I worked as CEO of Zolar, which is a residential solar company. Really, really enjoyed that, although it's a very tough, very volatile space. But I feel, fundamentally the energy transition is something we as humanity needs to fix. And if there's any role I can play in that, I'm keen to do so. The second area I feel very passionately about is healthcare. I think we can see an aging population. I think we can see in the UK our kind of fiscal situation not being easy, and therefore the NHS really sort of struggling to deal with how it does address an aging population, sort of more complicated healthcare environment, without any more money. And the answer to that, I think, as was seen in the 10-year plan sort of a couple of weeks ago, is we need to embrace technology, and we need new ways of working. And so I was brought on to Guy's and St Thomas's as a sort of digital non-exec director to help them with some of the productivity improvements, help them address AI for healthcare, help them look at things like sort of how you use data and to analyze sort of population health statistics. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And many of the dynamics we've been talking about when it comes to growth, and how the organizational structures that enable growth actually are just as true now in the NHS as they would have been in a company. One of the big pushes as the 10-year plan is to neighborhood health systems, right? Which is the equivalent of trying to breed autonomy and to take autonomy out of the center and push it into trusts, and then push it from trusts into neighborhoods. If you think of some of the Amazonian principles of how do you do that, how do you try and allow autonomy while keeping it coordinated, I think there's great alignments there. So I can see both in the opportunities for technology, and also in the opportunities for sort of new organizational forms within the NHS. I think it's going to be a very interesting space. And then the third thing I'm looking at within my portfolio career is really, I'm particularly reflecting on my time at Uber, where, because I was taken to court and I was shoved up in front of the BBC and asked some very important but difficult questions about, are you a force for good? Um, are you doing the right thing by cities? Are you doing the right thing by drivers? Um, I'm really also working on what is the role of companies and the relationship that companies should have with society. And I've been doing some teaching at LSE. The LSE has a London School of Economics has a Marshall Institute, which is set up to look at private action for public good, is the sort of mantra of the institute. I've been doing some teaching on their master's course. And I've also written a book to sort of almost try and tell some of my Uber experiences and then try and generalize them to say, look, are there things that we could be concluding from, the existential sort of 4 years that I lived at Uber that other companies might learn from to sort of try and strike the balance that they have between their stakeholders slightly differently. And so between those three things, which is the energy transition, kind of healthcare, and rethinking the purpose of the company, hopefully I've got a good next 20 years of exciting work ahead of me.
What would your preview be for the book? What are the kind of edited highlights, I suppose, of what you're putting in
Yeah,
there?
I mean the key thing is I think we need to rethink what companies are about. I think fundamentally, if you look at the history of the company, and it goes all the way back to ancient Rome, companies are society's best problem solvers. That's why the institution has grown up. It allows resources to come into one place, people to come into one place, individuals to share risk. And it's been given these great attributes by the state for sort of limited liability and eternal life and all of these things. But we've sort of forgotten, I think, that companies exist because they're very good at solving problems, at deploying resources to solve problems. And those are society's problems, not the problems of a particular shareholder or a particular stakeholder. So, what the book is it really is trying to rethink how we think about companies by going into the company's history and sort of then bringing that up to date with my own personal experiences where, you know, I had to kind of grapple with some of those issues myself. And I didn't find my business school MBA at all useful in allowing me to do that. I actually found my undergraduate degree in psychology and philosophy much more useful.
Yeah, yeah. And just back to, technology in healthcare, because it is such an important topic. I think we've talked about digitizing healthcare, digitizing the NHS for a long time, and clearly progress is very slow in that regard. So with your considerable experience of digitizing companies or being in technology, what do you think needs to change, I suppose, in healthcare in order to allow that to happen?
I think one of the core things that needs to start to enable digitization is we need a single common digital patient record. If you look at one of the great frustrations that patients have interacting with the NHS, is they're continually having to update. No, I told that to someone else, right? And until you have a common data record that includes all the patient information, it's hard to sort of get going. And so, in Guy's and St Thomas's, we've just launched Epic, which is a common software platform that works across the whole trust now. And it's the biggest global implementation of Epic anywhere in the world. And once you've got that, all sorts of things become possible because you can then start to integrate it forward into GP surgeries and they then build on the common record. You've then got this huge sort of wealth of patient data, which you can start to run sort of uh, pre-diagnostic checks on. So you can start to say, given this population, given that individual, given these symptoms, who should we be proactively reaching out to? But, digitization only works when the initial raw material is there, right? The raw material has to be sort of patient data and patient information turned into bits and bytes. And I think, different trusts are at different phases in that journey. But I think, that was identified as one of the three shifts by Wes Streeting, right? Digital to analog, sort of hospital to community, and sort of treatment to prevention, and so putting digital absolutely out there and putting the patient single patient digital record out there is going to be essential, because if that's in place, we can start to do all sorts of really exciting stuff. And UK is uniquely well qualified because the NHS is a single provider. So whereas in many other countries, all these data records are therefore fragmented, we have a hugely diverse population and a single provider. So when it comes therefore to using that data to run treatments, to effectively see what treatments would be effective, and to look at population health and diagnostics, it's one of the most rich, most sort of diverse patient records in the world. So it could be really, really, really exciting.
Yeah, it's never been more important, and also never been more important to do the work you're doing about thinking about what companies mean. I think particularly in today's world where technology is evolving so rapidly, we're sort of sitting in the midst of a massive technological shift, maybe the biggest of our lifetimes with AI. And my final question is just around, having seen seismic shifts and led companies through them, what advice would you give to companies and to the people within them as they adapt to the new technology that's taking hold with AI?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I think of the big shifts that I've been trying to surf, right? And a technology shift is a bit like a tidal wave, right? I mean, if you can catch it and ride it, it's fantastic fun, but it'll also kill you if you don't ride it well. But I think the obvious one for me has been mobile, which and the mobile wave. So when I started that, penetration was 5%, it's now 130%, whatever it is. I think the other big shift has been in the sort of solar growth. And I think we've now got the start of very early stages of the AI kind of shift. I think my observations on big technology shifts like that is the long term is often clearer than the short term. So I think, we we could quite reliably say that, back in 1997, mobile penetration was going to grow very, very quickly. I think we can, with a lot of confidence, say, solar's penetrate, it's just the proportion of energy produced by solar is going to grow very, very quickly. But knowing the long run trend sort of is not, it's not linear. So effectively there are many, many oscillations, and there are many, many hard to predict changes that massive tidal wave sort of rolls through. So, and therefore, if you think the long-term trend is guaranteed and therefore you just extrapolate forward, you're likely to die in the process. And therefore, I think my guidance to managers who are and leaders who are trying to lead through these trends is prioritize organizational agility and flexibility. Don't hard code your business to a belief that the trend will run linearly, because when it doesn't, you will be outcompeted by people who are more agile to the change. And that means don't prioritize efficiency, prioritize adaptability, even if there's costs to that, because your ability to ride and change direction is so important. My advice to individuals, and this is probably, I guess, music to the ears of anyone in the recruitment industry, is, see your career in terms of the wave itself, not the individual companies on the wave. So if I look at my career in mobile telecoms, which was 15 years long, I rode it with Orange, I rode it with then 3 different Virgin companies. And, if I'd stayed hitched to, and each of those had a different flavor, right? Each of those was playing the game in a slightly different way. And that allowed me to I would say, stay ahead of the wave and to ride it in different ways. And I think if you try and ride a wave with one company, you either have to be very lucky that you pick the company that both starts the wave and ends the wave ahead, which is extremely unlikely, or you've got to be, constantly watching how the wave develops and thinking, actually, I'd rather be in a different company. It's better for me to try and ride this wave from a slightly different place. So I think, what is required of leaders and of people charting their careers is slightly different. But they both, the underlying insight is waves are tumultuous and there's a lot of eddies within waves. So don't get desensitized to the fact that, a wave is just a linear wave. It's not. It's a big tidal wave that's very, very hard to surf.
Yeah. Which you've seen many, many times in your career,
I
David.
have the grey hairs to show.
And just as we bring this to a close, is there one last piece of advice or secret to scaling that you'd leave us with?
I think the key thing is stay away from bureaucracy. I think the managerial desire to control and to harmonize and to sort of know what's going on is both understandable, but it's the kiss of death for growth. And how you allow a business to grow without it becoming out of control, without introducing bureaucracy. I think that's the sort of secret sauce to scaling.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, Jamie. This has been a real pleasure. I'm eagerly anticipating the book.
Right.
When's it out?
Hopefully first quarter next year.
Okay.
Fingers crossed.
All right. Well, I look forward to that and to continue watching your journey as well.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
Thanks, Jamie.